Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Lauren, and today I'm going to be talking about what happens when a spirit dies or a person dies suddenly. So just a disclaimer, this is sort of how I have interpreted, picked up messages about this topic. This is also a combination of what I've heard other psychics say or what I've read, but it might not be the case for every spirit out there, and it might not be the case at all. I like to make sure that I preface this with, I could be wrong. These are my personal experiences, having done several readings. So sort of what prompted this video is recently I lost my cousin. And it was a very sudden passing, and it was bittersweet because I've learned a lot of interesting things having been through the experience, but I obviously lost someone out of it. So I'm hoping that my experience that happened will help some of you who have maybe lost loved ones suddenly. This could even be pets as well. Understand what they might have gone through and maybe how to tell the difference, if they're stuck, if they're not stuck, and just common things that people sort of ask when it comes to somebody dying suddenly, which is, I would say, about half the readings I do. There's a lot of people who want to know what happened with someone that died suddenly, or they could have somebody in spirit that had, a peaceful transition, and I'll talk about both. So not all of you might get the opportunity, but sometimes what happens is, if somebody is in the hospital, or somebody is close to dying but they haven't died yet, and you have the opportunity to be there right before that happens, which is a lot of people in hospitals tend to have that chance. One of the things that I often get asked is, were they there with me? Could they hear what I was saying when I was next to them in that hospital bed or something like that? And usually they can. And I think, I don't want to say this is always the case, but I think when someone is close to death, in ways, I think their body separates. I think they slowly sort of pull back from their physical body and they detach. And so sometimes, even though their body might be alive still, I think sometimes, not all the time, they might be pulling away and they might be almost there in spirit. And so that's why a lot of the times when people ask that question, I really do believe they can hear you. They hear what they were saying. Maybe they didn't feel a whole lot of that pain that some people are worried about. Sometimes they separate from their body, sometimes not. I think that this comes down to preserving themselves and trying to keep themselves from feeling those physical feelings or that trauma, and just to help them deal with that experience better. But again, not always does that happen. Another thing that people tend to get hung up on is, I wasn't there in those moments right when they passed. I wasn't there. And also another question that I'm remembering too is, was there somebody there waiting for them on the other side? And just know that generally what I get from spirit is they don't care if you were there in that moment. When they look back on their lives, they show me it as such a blip, and the things that worry us, the things that stress us out, they don't care about that anymore. Maybe in the moment they did, but now that they're in spirit, now that they're gone, now that they're released from that, they tend to not be so stressed out about stuff like that at all. And in regards to if there was somebody there waiting for them in spirit, usually, almost always, I see somebody or many beings. They're not always related to them. They might be their guides. They might be some angel or somebody they believed in as a spiritual guide of some sort. I almost never ever see a spirit pass and be like alone and lost. That's almost never the case. There's always somebody there. Now, whether or not they are aware of them is another question, and I'll get into that. So if you have the opportunity to be in that moment where that person is sort of in that in-between state, I would encourage you to think about, whether or not you want to see the person like that. And I know that might be controversial because you're like, well, I have to be there in those last moments. But if they're already gone, and I'm going to use my dog as an example of this. My dog passed away 7 years ago. My mom called me up, said the dog is gone, and do you want to come say goodbye before we take him to the vet? And I had to think about it, and I had to decide, you know what? No, I don't want those lasting moments to be of that image of him. Just because I wanted to remember my dog as my dog and not this, is a grotesque thing, or this thing that maybe I wouldn't be able to erase out of my mind very well. And some of you might not be bothered by that at all, but I think when I was younger, I got thrown into some funerals, and they were open casket, and I didn't think about whether I should be looking at that stuff or not. And I think some of those memories really, I had to really work to get rid of them and get rid of the negativity around them. So I'd encourage you to at least have that thought in your brain and wonder if you want to see that or not. And I think why I'm being so careful about all of this is because I don't want anyone to think that they have to abandon, the person that they love in those final moments. That's not at all what I'm suggesting. But in these very specific moments where, they might already be gone, pet or person, thinking about you and your healing, I think is something we don't encourage enough. And so I really hope that at least gives you some food for thought. Now, for the rest of us, sometimes we don't get to say goodbye. Usually a sudden passing is pretty sudden. And this is a really volatile time. People are shocked because it happened quickly. Obviously, there's a lot of disbelief going on. I mean, you don't have the time to prepare for something like this. People are grieving, and that looks different for different people. Some people have to shut themselves away. Some people have to be around others. Some people have to be in denial. Some people have to find a reason or find someone to blame, something to attach to so that they can find closure in some sort of way. And then I think another thing that happens is everyone is desperately trying to connect with that person. Sometimes when people pass suddenly, there might be a question of why or how, or they just don't understand, and so they get hung up on these questions and they have to know. And everyone's trying desperately to reach out to that person in spirit, or that animal in spirit. And what's interesting around that, of what happens, is suddenly you become much more intuitive. And when everyone in a family is sort of doing this, when everyone is being super intuitive and thinking about them all the time, you start to notice little things happening. There's these little signs, and you'll think something moved, or you'll have a dream or something like this. And I think that's just a product of everyone's group intention, thinking about that person or that spirit. And when you're constantly thinking about them 24/7, I mean, in a way, your psychic ability is sort of getting more honed, just purely because you're trying to use it more. I think another thing that happens is some people in the family are more intuitive, and some people aren't. And so some of those people are trying to connect and being like, oh my gosh, I dreamed about them, I saw them, blah, blah, blah. And other people are pretty bummed out because they haven't felt them or seen them or heard them. And so I go over this in my other video of how you can sort of connect to spirits after they've gone, and understanding how the psychic ability works and doesn't work, and why you might not be feeling that spirit versus why somebody else might be. So check out that video if you're really wanting to learn how to connect better. But the reason why I'm describing that this time and this energy is because, mostly for you other psychics out there, my rule is never to read during this period. Especially if a spirit passes suddenly, I almost always have a week rule. And I tell people, give it a week. I know that sucks, but If you still want a reading in a week, absolutely, let's set it up. Specifically with the stuff that happened with my family, I had to push them off even more because there's a lot of ethical things about reading for family, and I'm going to do a different video on that. But you don't want to be reading for people in that moment because they are grieving. They need to go through their own journeys, and if you are coming in and telling them how to feel and giving them all this information, they just might not be ready to hear it yet. And I think the energy of desperation of wanting to be able to connect is not a good energy to be hearing a reading, because usually you don't really listen, you don't really hear what you need to hear, you're just looking for what you want to hear. And so I don't like giving out readings during this time because of that reason. Also, the spirit is still trying to, or the person or the animal is still trying to sort out where they are. Specifically with my family member that passed away, I was constantly tuning in to him to see where he was at. And one day he would be worse, one day he would be better. And it was crazy how up and down it was. And so, what I've learned through this is to really take my time before reading for somebody that's passed suddenly, because what if I would have read them on day 2 and they were really down low and I communicated that message of they're really not doing good. But then, what if the next day that spirit was totally fine and doing better? So it's really important that you understand all these things that are going on at play, because it could really affect the readings that you're giving. And although I preface everything with I could be wrong, I think because everyone is more volatile and more vulnerable, I think it's my job to say no, not right now, because they might not be understanding of why they shouldn't get a reading at that moment. So if you're currently in this spot of having lost someone recently, I'm so sorry. Please know that you can reach out to me for a reading at any time. And some things that you can do right now, check out the other video that I just mentioned, because I go over some things you can do. But you can just send that spirit, that loved one, white light. Maybe you're worried about if they're fully passed or not. What you can do is imagine them, send them white light, send them love. There's nothing wrong with that. That will only help them. Another thing I say that you can do in this moment is to pay attention to the signs. But it's interesting because some spirits might not be there, might not be ready to communicate for a week or a month or several months. And just know that it's not always about you and whether or not you can pick up on them or not. They might be doing their own stuff over there and they're not ready to come back and chat yet. That happens. Sometimes some of them are right there almost immediately and you can start having that conversation. It's hard to know, but if you do start paying attention to the signs, you'll notice little things come up. For example, with my cousin, it was like that whole week afterwards, I just saw bubbles everywhere. Bubbles. It was like bubbles on the TV. I was driving next to my work and there was a guy on the street blowing these huge big bubbles out into traffic just to make people happy. And so, I could have just discounted that, but because it was so weird and out of place, I paid attention to it. And so now I associate bubbles with my cousin. And, if I stop receiving those messages, he might give me something else instead that I can associate with him. But no, sometimes spirits will try to come through and establish that communication. So just pay attention to it, but also don't beat yourself up if it doesn't happen right away. So the last part of this video that I kind of want to go over is, how do you know if that spirit is fully crossed or not? Firstly, I really don't like the term fully crossed or stuck or not stuck. But for lack of better terms, I still use them because I just don't have anything better to say. How I interpret crossed versus not crossed. A spirit that's not crossed might have messages that it still wants to deliver. I see them as very earthly, very full-bodied, like I almost see or hear them as if they're in the room with me. Versus a spirit that's passed might be farther away, might be harder to communicate. For whatever reason, I see them up above. And it's going to be different for every psychic. Every psychic has different cues that they've established. And so, my guides have established, okay, Lauren, if you see them kind of further away up above, that means they're a little bit more crossed. But not everyone will see them that way. That's just my language that my guides use so that they can get the message across correctly. Another pretty easy way to know if a spirit is not fully crossed or stuck is they might have just denser or darker energy. You might look at their aura and it might feel dark or gray. It just might not have a light color in general. Another way you can know is that when you talk to them, it's very much still about them and their agenda and what they need to do and what you need to do for them. And you know, that's very ego, that's very this realm. And so when they're not fully crossed over and they still talk like they would as if they were here, that's sort of an indication to me that they're not fully crossed over. Whereas somebody that is fully crossed over tends not to care less about, or they tend not to care about their agendas as much. It's more about you and how they can help you. And they tend to sound more like a guide, and more enlightened is the only word I can think of really to best describe it. How these spirits can get stuck, I've noticed, is maybe they just didn't have anyone to talk to, and maybe they kept reliving this moment, or they kept sitting in their questions or what they wanted to say, and they sat in it so much that they forgot to move on, because they're just so, they need to get this across so much. And don't stress out about it, because their concept of time is a lot different. You know, things can happen like this. It can happen a lot faster. So even though they might be stuck for like years, you know, once they have moved forward, I don't see that as like, oh my gosh, I was stuck in this cage for like 3 full years. They don't experience time in that way. And this is what they've told me. Again, this can change, and I could be wrong. I've also seen somebody who might have had a mental disorder in this life, and when they passed, didn't quite understand that they had passed, and were still sort of stuck living that same life. They might also beat themselves up, and obviously there might be a lot of guilt around their passing, and all of these things can sort of weigh on their energy and keep their energy down and darkened, is the only way I can describe it. But they can also have a pretty peaceful transition. You know, just because they pass suddenly doesn't mean they can't pass peacefully. And so it's definitely a case-by-case basis. It's hard to say for every single spirit what happens. Now, someone who's more crossed, you might feel them being lighter. You might see them lighter. You might see them up above, higher in clouds. You know, your guides, once you have read enough, will show you different ways to differentiate the two. And that's just how I see them, is they're lighter. I almost see them without a body. They're more just energy. They're just like a ball of light, but I know it's them. I see them as less burdened. They don't really care about what's going on in our lives, you know, other than to give us positive, happy messages. They're more truthful too. They won't lie to you, whereas cross spirits will sometimes still lie to get what they want. They just tend to feel more like guides, and again, that enlightened energy. So when it comes to a spirit being stuck or not stuck, I really don't see it as a line in the sand of, okay, this spirit is stuck and he just needs to do this one thing and then he's perfectly fine. You know, that's actually how I used to see it. And, you know, as I read more and as I experience things more, I see it very differently. And so this kind of came from my cousin passing. You know, I would tune into him, and some days he would be better than others. And I was like, that is interesting. You'd think there's only a positive progression, but that definitely wasn't the case. There were some days where he was worse than others. I do think there's probably a line where it gets consistently better. But how I am seeing spirits now is sort of, it's like a spectrum of how unburdened they are. You know, on the negative end being like they are so stressed and they have so many burdens around this life and the things that they have to say or the things they didn't say and that guilt. And then as they heal, either by giving those messages or by doing their own work, they get lighter and lighter in energy. I just see it as not a firm line that you're crossed or you're not crossed. I see it as a progression into light. That's the way I see it. That doesn't mean that that's true for everyone. That just might be the way my guides are communicating it to me. But it also feels like, clairsentiently, it feels like a denser energy getting into a lighter energy. And I think spirits can move along this spectrum. Again, intuitively, I feel like there's a line where they can't go back because they've completely let go of that past life and that ego, and they've moved forward. That's how I like to describe a spirit being crossed or not crossed. And you can understand why I just tend to default to that term, because it's so hard to explain this to people. And I'm curious, how would you guys sum up what I just said? Because I think I need to communicate it in a better way of there are lighter. I think lighter in weight, maybe is what I should start saying. So moving forward, I think a lot of us are worried about if that spirit has fully crossed or not. And really, I want you guys to know that the biggest takeaway is it's really not something you can totally help with. It's really on them. It is their journey. There's certain things we can do, which is, go to a psychic, talk to them, let them say what they want to say. But sometimes that doesn't help all the time, and they think they need to say these things, but then they still can't move on. So just know that it's a lot their own personal journey. They have to heal. They have to understand the lessons that they went through in this life and move forward from it. They have to see how they passed and come to terms with that and move forward. So the biggest thing I would say to do is, if you feel like a spirit is maybe stuck, send them love, send them light, and if you really want to delve into this further, reach out to a psychic, or maybe start developing your psychic abilities if you're really curious on helping these spirits cross over a little bit more. I certainly feel to some extent that when I come across spirits, I definitely don't give them my full time and energy and be like, oh, this is my job, I have to pass along every single spirit. But what I do at the least is put up my wall and say, don't bother me, but here's some love, here's some light, you are past, you can cross over. So I hope this provides a little bit of relief, a little bit of closure for some of you. Just know that when someone dies suddenly, they really are in a better place. They might not be in the absolute best place in that moment, but they're a lot better off than they were here. And the messages tend to be sort of along that same line. And there's things you can do to help them move forward. But again, know that that's really their own personal journey. But I hope this at least this gives you an understanding of how I see it, so that you can understand, oh, maybe they are crossed, maybe they aren't. And just at least, I guess this is more of a regurgitation of how I see spirits when they pass. So I'm curious, you guys, have you had any similar experiences? Do you feel like you have any spirits that are related to you that might be stuck or not? Do you guys have any certain ways of differentiating between if they're past or not past, if they're lightened or not? Always know that you guys can reach out to me. I'm happy to do readings. Just visit my website, psychiclauren.com. And I hope that this has provided some reassurance. I think that in a lot of ways I needed this video. And know that your loved ones are with you. They are in spirit. You can communicate with them at any time. You might not be able to hear them, but they can hear you. Thanks so much for watching, you guys. I hope you have an awesome day. I will see you next time. Bye.